the initial act of settler colonialism, that act of ethnic cleansing, has really been central to shifting Palestinians from being largely a peasant community to becoming a wage laborer community. And that's something we still see, because it wasn't just a process of ethnic cleansing and military occupation. Hand in hand with this has been a process of economic pacification, trying to strangle the Palestinian economy. Now there's a military occupation, but also a very strict and serious economic pacification policy that's built on destroying Palestinian livelihoods and then asking them to accept whatever is on offer just so they can live. Now, what this means is increasing numbers of Palestinians have to leave work, have to find work, In order to find work, a lot of them are forced to immigrate and leave. And we've seen a lot of young people from Gaza, for example, take that dreadful journey through the Mediterranean and die along the way. Or a lot of people are forced to work in the Israeli labor market because there's nothing for them in the Palestinian market. Essentially, kicking people off of their land, making sure the economy is strangulated, is to leave them with very little choice. It's a very fast-moving situation because labor demands are changing. Initially, everyone was talking about health and the healthcare sector and trying to contain as quickly as possible. But now, as the economic questions are really starting to bite, and here what I referred to earlier about the informal sector is really important, because with the changes of the Paris Protocol and the changes in the political economy of the occupied territories, those changes were essentially a World Bank blueprint of how an economy should be structured. So the Palestinian economy, as much as we can say there is one today, is very much structured on the service sector. And most of that service sector is actually informal. So people that have been told to go into lockdown are paycheck to paycheck, live paycheck to paycheck, or are in the informal sector completely and cannot depend on that coming all the time. And that's really starting to bite, and there's no provision right now for how those workers will be dealt with. It's important to remember that those workers that go into the Israeli economy, either in the illegal settlements or inside the Green Line, a lot of them are people whose own land has been confiscated, so they have no other source of income, or are refugees living in overcrowded refugee camps and have to make that journey in order to live and survive. There's around 133,000 who have permits to enter Israel, but that's just the permits that we know about. There's of course an entire black market in permits, and Palestinian laborers get really abused through that black market in permits to be able to enter. And again, I want to stress that these are people entering for their livelihoods in order to be able to put food on the table. And this permit system binds them with the Israeli state in really terrible ways. You have to make sure that no member of your family does any political activities. You have to make sure that your record is clear. A lot of them are forced into collaboration in order to get this permit. And recently, of course, these permits have also become biometric to bring in the surveillance angle again. These workers have been treated, of course, horribly since the beginning. I'll speak about it a little bit more if we do speak about construction, or I can just keep going and talk about construction if that's okay. All right. The majority of these workers are construction workers. Some of them are agricultural workers, and a very small percentage also work in factories. At the beginning, they were told that they would be able to stay in Israel for a period, and that the Israeli state would provide some sort of housing for them. That never happened. They were being treated horribly if they stayed within the 48 areas. So the Palestinian Authority called them back. And a lot of them complied. Some of them did not comply and stayed behind inside Israel, and they're still living in horrifying conditions. Israel has provided them with an app that explains where they are. This is a surveillance app, essentially, that can also have access to your entire phone. But the most terrible thing that was happening was once they were infected or they were known to be infected, Israel was just throwing them at a checkpoint on the apartheid wall. So essentially, Israel uses Palestinians as cheap labor, but then dumps them and dumps all the responsibility when they don't want it anymore. And that was part of the reason the Palestinian Authority asked for them to come back home. The problem is, then they became really vilified as a vector for spreading the virus. And the trouble is, you can ask workers to stay in lockdown, but if you do not take into consideration the fact that they need to feed their families most of the time and they are working day to day with very horrible wages, it's very difficult to maintain the lockdown. Now, the language of securitization, and I spoke about this earlier, like militarizing the situation and securitizing it, makes workers a security threat. And we have seen this not just in Palestine, but in South Africa and in Nigeria, the deployment of police services or the military to block people from being able to go outside and earn a living. Here, let's stress that the workers, at least with permits, pay taxes and pay dues to the Histadrut, which confiscates most of this money. And they also, some of that money goes to the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions. So there's been a lot of projection of any support for workers as if it's charity. Like we will support our poor workers, but in reality, these are worker dues that are owed. If we think of the construction sector in particular, the Israeli construction sector owes these workers their money, owes these workers their health benefits, and they are not complying. But the Palestinian construction sector as well owes these Palestinian workers because that's how a lot of their own money was made. So this vilification of Palestinian labor has really, really been terrible. And I think we need to think about very specifically demands for labor rights in this situation. In an economic situation that was already terrible beforehand, things are only getting worse. And if we don't put forward very clear demands around the rights of Palestinian labor, whether they are laborers inside the occupied territories or the ones that go back and forth, then we're going to really be seeing them crushed under the weight of this pandemic.